All right, welcome. We're here to vote the budget of the state of Maryland. We're going to start with education and economic development. Delegates, Chair Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the members of the subcommittee, Vice Chair Sarah Wolick, Delegate Catherine Forbes, Delegate Jefferson Greist, Delegate Adrian Jones, and Delegate Karen Tolles, and the committee staff, Laura Hyde, Carol Smith, Addie Fleming, Zelshadai Solomon, and budget analysts Natalie Andrade, Sarah Baker, Catherine Barber, Connor Brown, Patrick Frank, Madeline Miller, David Propert, Micah Richards, Elizabeth Weibel, and Mary Beth Brisky, who edited this document.
Beginning with the Governor's Office for Children on pages 1 through 3, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to restrict funds for an annual report and reduced a grant. On page 4, for the Maryland Stadium Authority, the subcommittee reduced funds supporting a canceled event. For the Office of the Inspector General for Education, on page 5, the subcommittee rejected narrative requesting a report on local cooperation with the office. On page 6, for West North Avenue Development Authority, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting a report. For the Maryland Department of Labor, on page 7, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to reduce funding for a grant. For Maryland State Department of Education headquarters, on pages 8 through 14, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to restrict funds pending a report. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt 5 pieces of narrative and modified narrative requesting a report on Chief Financial Officer qualifications. The subcommittee also rejected narrative requesting a report on a free driver education plan. On pages 15 through 21 are actions for MSDE Aid to Education. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to delete funding for a program and reduce funding for another program. The subcommittee added language prohibiting MSDE from transferring aid to education funds to any other program or purpose and rejected intent language related to public school counselors. In addition, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt 4 pieces of narrative requesting annual reports and modified narrative requesting a report on the Autism Waiver Program to include information on life skill classes. For MSDE funding for education organizations on pages 22 through 25, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add 2 pieces of language related to the broadening options and opportunities for Students Today program.
For the MSDE Early Childhood Development, on pages 26 and 27, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports. On pages 28 and 29, for the Accountability and Implementation Board, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting a report. For the University of Maryland College Park, on page 30, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to reduce funds. For the University of Maryland Global Campus, on pages 31 and 32, the subcommittee rejected narrative on the national marketing campaign and concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting a report. For the Maryland Higher Education Commission, on pages 33 through 38, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to reduce funds and concurred with adding 3 pieces of language restricting funds pending reports. The subcommittee increased the amount of restricted funds pending submission of a report on actions to address audit findings. The subcommittee also adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports. On pages 39 and 40, for MHEC, Student Financial Assistance, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting a report and modified narrative for a report on the impact of credit completion requirements on financial aid. We also have an additional page for your consideration on loan forgiveness. For state support for higher education institutions, on pages 41, the first item is technical and reflects actions previously taken by the subcommittee. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative for an annual report. For Baltimore City Community College, on page 42, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting a report. On pages 43 through 45, for the Department of Commerce, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add language restricting funds pending submission of a report. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate to reduce funding for 2 programs, but restored funding for another program. For the Maryland Technology Development Corporation, on page 46, the subcommittee reduced funding for a program. On page 47, in the Sunny Day Fund, the subcommittee reduced funding for 1 program. Mr. Chair, move adoption of the subcommittee report.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to you and your vice chair for so much hard work and your entire committee and this great package you've put together for us. Any questions of the subcommittee? Any discussion on the subcommittee report? Subcommittee report's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed to subcommittee report, raise your hand. Subcommittee report is adopted. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Move to HSS. Chair Shetty and Vice Chair Jones, welcome.
All right, we're here. Want to stay next to me? I'm here. We're in the middle. Okay.
Okay, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First, I want to take a moment to thank members of our subcommittee, Vice Chair Dana Jones, Delegate Jim Heinbaugh, Delegate Alethea McCaskill, Delegate Malcolm Ruff, and Delegate Joshua Stanko. Our committee staff, Joe Gutt-Burlett, who has been everybody's been absolutely incredible, but, Joe's very special to us. The budget analysts, Suveksha Bujal, Ann Braun, Connor Brown, Emily Haskell, Naomi Kimura, Victoria Martinez, and Tanya Zimmerman. And I want to take also a moment to thank Dominic Sinelli, who edited this report. Beginning on page 1 with the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing, the subcommittee restored funding for a position, struck 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending a letter confirming publication of regulations and a report on vacant positions, and instead adopted 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on these topics. On pages 5 through 8, in the Department of Aging, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to reduce funds for turnover expectancy and to adopt narrative requesting reports on the implementation of the Supporting Older Adults with Resources, or SOAR program, and managing for results measures for the SOAR program. The subcommittee also added language restricting funds in the Naturally Occurring Retirement Communities program for specific recipients, and adopted narrative requesting a report on senior center facility conditions. In the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, on page 9, the subcommittee modified narrative requesting a report on case backlogs to add information on the classification of new positions. On page 10, in the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting a report on the reinsurance and state subsidy program costs and forecasts. Actions related to the Maryland Department of Health are on pages 11 through 54. Beginning on page 11, in administration, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending a report on staffing at the Pediatric Overstay Unit at the John L. Gildner-Rica, and a report on the replacement of patients at state forensic hospitals. The subcommittee also concurred with narrative requesting a report on staffing at state hospitals.
In the Office of Healthcare Quality, on page 15 and 16, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending a report on the long-term care program complaint investigation backlog, and a report on memorandum of understanding with Montgomery County for nursing home survey activities. In the health professional boards and commissions, beginning on page 17, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add 3 pieces of language restricting funds pending a reports on the Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists evaluation recommendation updates, the impact of fund balance transfers on the boards, and a letter confirming the submission of regulations related to prescription labels. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate to add narratives requesting the total licenses and complaint rate for the Board of Nursing be included in the MFR data. On pages 21 and 22 in the Prevention and Health Promotion Administration, the subcommittee concurred with the technical change to contingent language and to the to increase the amount of general fund reduction contingent reducing the tobacco use prevention mandate to align with the proposed mandate level. The subcommittee also concurred with language restricting funds pending a report on newborn health screening. Actions related to the Behavioral Health Administration begin on page 23. First, the subcommittee concurred with language restricting funds pending the submission of several items: a report on efforts to strengthen the behavioral health workforce, a report on the agency's transition to the new ASO, the status of corrective actions related to repeat audit findings, non-Medicaid provider reimbursement data, the fiscal 2028 budget with community service provider reimbursement spending budgeted separately, and a report on the timelines of payments to local core service agency. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add annual language to 3 programs and a deficiency appropriation restricting funds for provider reimbursements to that purpose. The subcommittee also concurred with language restricting funds in the community service program to be used to support peer recovery specialist certification and internships. And the subcommittee concurred with 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on financing options for long-acting injectable medication and reimbursable fund spending in behavioral health Medicaid.
Actions pertaining to the Developmental Disabilities Administration begin on page 34. The subcommittee modified language restricting funds pending reports on community services spending data to request additional data and increase the submission frequency. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add language restricting funds pending reports on service utilization trends and cost containment actions, restricting funding in the community services program to that purpose, and specifying the implementation of a dedicated hours cost containment action. And the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting a report on person-centered plan review processing times. The subcommittee also added language specifying the implementation of cost containment actions related to rate reductions and individuals funded with state-only funded services, and day-to-day administrative supports for participants in self-directed services. Under Medicaid, beginning on page 43, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add language restricting funds pending reports on home and community-based services and corrective actions related to the most recent audit. The subcommittee also concurred with language restricting funds for provider reimbursements for Medicaid and the Maryland Children's Health Program to those purposes, or for certain other transfers. On pages 45 and 46, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add language making funding from the Cigarette Restitution Fund contingent on a BRFA provision and make a technical change to contingent language. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate to reduce funds to account for end-stage renal disease patients covered under Medicare and reduce fiscal 2026 deficiencies to account for reduced spending for prior year claims and medical loss ratio recoveries. The subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting 2 reports on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act implementation and adopted new narrative requesting a report on prescription drug reimbursement.
Beginning on page 52, in the Health Regulatory Commissions, the subcommittee modified language to increase the amount of funds restricted pending a report on market stabilization for Medicare Advantage plans. The subcommittee also concurred with language making a technical correction for a contingent special fund reduction and narrative requesting a report on primary care initiatives and temporary staffing contracts. Upon further consideration, the subcommittee moves to modify the narrative on temporary staffing contracts as shown on the additional page. Subcommittee actions pertaining to the Department of Human Services begin on page 55 in the Office of the Secretary. The subcommittee concurred with language restricting funds pending a report on fiscal 2026 closeout information. The subcommittee also restored funding for 2 system applications and for the Constituent Service Call Center in fiscal 26 and 27. Actions pertaining to the Social Services Administration begin on page 59. The subcommittee concurred with 5 pieces of language restricting funds pending submission of reports on youth stays in hospitals, hotels, and other unlicensed settings, child welfare services caseloads, status of corrective actions related to repeat audit findings, costs associated with youth in out-of-home placements placed in hotels, and pediatric hospital overstays. In addition to letters confirming the posting of monthly child welfare services data and submissions of Medicaid state plan amendment. The subcommittee concurred with 2 pieces of narrative requesting updates on the implementation of provisions of the Family First Prevention Services Act and child fatalities.
On pages 68 and 69 in the foster care maintenance and child welfare services programs, the subcommittee concurred with 3 pieces of language restricting funds to that purpose. On pages 70 through 72 in the Child Support Administration, the subcommittee restored funds for non-custodial parent employment and training contracts and for the Constituent Services Call Center, and concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting child support performance reports and a reconciliation of the Child Support Reinvestment Fund. In the Family Investment Administration, beginning on page 73, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate on 4 reductions to remove funding for a program that was repealed, reflect the SNAP administrative match rate, reduce benefits to better align with expected levels, and reduce funds in fiscal '26 unneeded to support benefits in the federal government shutdown. The subcommittee also concurred with 3 pieces of language, including annual language restricting assistance payments funds to that purpose, restricting funds pending a report on application processing and case closures, and restricting funds pending a report on benefit calculations. The subcommittee increased the amounts of funds restricted for a 3rd report related to a plan to reduce SNAP payment error rates. The subcommittee also concurred with narrative requesting a report on program participation and expressing intent regarding administrative expense budgeting. In the Office of Home Energy Programs, beginning on page 82, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add language restricting funds pending a report with application processing times and denial rates for energy assistance, reduce general funds for personnel expenses, and adopt narrative requesting MFR data on energy assistance participation rates. Lastly, in the Department of Housing and Community Development, on pages 84 through 87, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on housing industry apprenticeships and housing production opportunities, add language restricting funds pending a report on vacant properties in Baltimore City, make technical changes to 2 pieces of contingent language, and add language expressing intent that community action agencies be defined as emergency providers. Move the adoption of the subcommittee report as amended.
Okay. Is there any discussion on the subcommittee report? Chair, Vice Chair, thank you so much for your hard work, not just the work that you've put out in your subcommittee, but we've had so many bills this session addressed in your subcommittee that you've just gotten to the floor in such a workmanlike manner. Just thank you so much for your great work.
Thank you.
All in favor of the subcommittee report, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, raise your hand. Subcommittee report is adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
We'll now move on to PSA. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the members of the Public Safety and Administration Subcommittee, Vice Chair Delegate Julian Ivey, Delegate Mark Chang, Delegate Ann Kaiser, and Delegate Barry Beecham, committee staff Yanisha Norris, as well as the budget analysts Natalie Andrade, Scott Benson, Connor Brown, Jacob Cash, Patrick Frank, Andrew Gray, Madeline Miller, David Proppert, Yashadara Rai, Micah Richards, Elizabeth Wable, and Josh Weinstock. I would like to thank Brett Oden, who formatted and edited this report. Beginning on page 1 with the judiciary, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to reduce funds by approximately $7 million for 6 purposes: restrict funds to be used only for the appointed attorney program, and adopt 7 pieces of narrative requesting various reports. The subcommittee further reduced funds for major IT projects and travel expenses. The subcommittee also restored funding for the district court contractual employee salary increases and 3 new positions for the St. Mary's County Circuit Court. The subcommittee modified narrative adopted by the Senate to request additional information on annual court performance measures. On pages 11 through 13 in the Office of the Public Defender, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate adopting 3 pieces of language restricting funds to be used for the intended purposes only. The subcommittee also restored funding for budgeted turnover and deficiency appropriation for IT expenses. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative requesting a report on panel attorney caseload. Mr. Chair, there is additional page for your consideration that requests a report on factors leading to an increase in caseloads for juvenile court matters and strategies to improve caseload management. The subcommittee moves to adopt this additional page.
Are we adopting just the page now or the whole report?
The whole report.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, excellent work. Your first year as subcommittee chair, you've shown us all what you're capable of. I think hope you're very proud of the work that you've done.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
there's still a little bit more. For us
Okay.
to do.
Got it. Go ahead.
So we're going to adopt the page, the additional page, correct? The
Okay.
additional page.
The additional
Mr.
page,
Chair.
all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, raise your hand. The ayes have it. We're still on the subcommittee report, however. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the Office of the Attorney General on pages 14 and 15, the subcommittee restored funding for travel expenses. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative for a report on the Access to Counsel in Evictions program. The subcommittee also struck narrative requesting a report on the Federal Accountability Unit.
On pages 16 and 17 in the Uninsured Employers Fund, the subcommittee modified language added by the Senate to restrict $1 million pending submission of a report with additional information on the agency's operational needs and fiscal condition of the fund. The subcommittee struck narrative requesting a similar report on the agency's operations and fiscal condition. In the Board of Public Works, on page 18, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate on annual Maryland Zoo reporting. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate to reduce funding for erroneous convictions payment due to availability of funding for this purpose in the dedicated purpose account. Beginning on page 19 in the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention and Policy, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to restrict funds for reports on the Victims of Crime Act grant program, youth prosecution outcomes, and the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate to restrict state aid for police protection enhancement funding pending attestation with certain requirements, to add narrative for a report on outcome managing for result measures, and to reduce the fiscal 2026 federal fund appropriation. The subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of language that express the General Assembly's intent that GOCAP provide the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault with certain information and that restrict state aid for police protection funds for communications encryption grants. In the Department of Social and Economic Mobility on pages 26 and 27, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to restrict funds pending submission of a report on minority business enterprise certification. The subcommittee adopted narrative for a report on transportation trust fund support for the Office of Minority Business Enterprises. On pages 28 and 29, in the State Board of Elections, the subcommittee modified narrative adopted by the Senate to request additional information on major IT projects. In the Military Department, on pages 30 and 31, the subcommittee modified language added by the Senate to restrict $250,000 pending submission of a report on the Free State Challenge Academy. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt narrative for submission on managing for results measures. Beginning on page 32, the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate adopting technical amendments to the budget bill language and 4 pieces of narrative requesting various reports. The subcommittee modified narrative requesting a report on implementing the Georges Creek Task Force recommendations. The subcommittee restored funding for one new position. On pages 37 and 38, in the Department of Veterans and Military Families, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to adopt two pieces of narrative requesting reports on the Charlottes Hall Veterans Home and Maryland Joins Forces initiatives. In the Office of the Correctional Ombudsman, on page 39, the subcommittee struck narrative requesting information on unsubmitted managing for results measures and instead adopted a piece of budget language requesting a report. On page 40, in the Comptroller of Maryland, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate adopting technical amendments to the budget bill language. On pages 41 and 42, in the State Department of Assessment and Taxation, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to delete one long-term vacant position and add language to restricting funds pending a report on an IT project. In the Property Tax Assessment Appeals Board, on pages 43 and 44, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate, adopting language restricting funds pending a report on the transition from paper-based processes and narrative for a report on vacancies and backlog cases. Beginning on page 45, in the Department of General Services, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate on two pieces of language restricting funds pending submission of corrective actions related to audit findings and three pieces of narrative for reports on the State Center relocation, utilization of Strategic Energy Investment Fund, and the critical maintenance backlog projects. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate modification on language restricting funds pending submission of a status report on the state's asset maximization strategies.
Actions on the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services can be found on pages 50 to 69. In the administration and offices function of the department, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate on 5 pieces of budget language requesting reports on major IT projects, healthcare contract oversight, overtime costs, hiring and attrition, and private home monitoring, and concurred with 2 pieces of committee narrative requesting reports on Justice Reinvestment Act and recidivism data. The subcommittee also adopted narrative for a report on the use of deficiency appropriations. Mr. Chair, the subcommittee also adopted language to restrict funds pending a letter until the healthcare contractor meets certain performance metrics. The subcommittee moves to change the program in which funds are being restricted to the Eastern Correctional Institution as a technical correction, Mr. Chair.
Take that up. Is this part of the full report, or does that have to be taken up separately?
We'll take that at the end.
Okay.
On pages 58 to 62, in the corrections function of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate on 2 pieces of committee narrative for reports on the treatment of transgender individuals and women's pre-release programming and modified narrative on the rollout of the reentry passport program. In the community supervision function on pages 63 through 65, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate, adopting 1 piece of language for a report on geriatric and medical parole, and 3 pieces of narrative requesting reports on parole and probation agent caseloads, providing protective equipment to community supervision agents, and the implementation of the delayed risk assessment tool. For the Police and Correctional Trainings Commissions with the department on pages 66 and 67, the subcommittee adopted back of the bill language that expresses the General Assembly's intent to add requirements for police certification and restrict funds pending submission of a report on the implementation of new requirements. In the Division of Pretrial Detention and Services function on pages 68 and 69, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate adopting language requesting a report on the department's compliance with the Duval v. Moore consent decree and modified narrative requesting a report on the new federal contract to operate the Chesapeake Detention Facility. Mr. Chair, there is additional page for your consideration that requests a report on the aging and medically frail incarcerated individuals. The subcommittee moves the adoption of the additional page.
I think the additional page is at the end after we adopt your full report.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 70, the Department of Juvenile Services, the subcommittee concurred with the Senate to add narrative for a report on the substance abuse programs for DJS plans to open. In the Department of Police on pages 71 through 74, the subcommittee added language expressing the General Assembly's intent that grant funding provided to the Maryland Sheriff's Association be used to provide training to law enforcement agencies on state law regarding immigration enforcement agreements. The subcommittee concurred with the Senate adding narrative for reports on personnel measures, registered apprenticeship opportunities, and workforce diversity strategies. The subcommittee also concurred with the Senate to add a back of the bill section for the annual Uniform Crime Report. Mr. Chair, I move the adoption of the subcommittee report as amended.
Second.
Okay, the report has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion on the report? As I was saying, Mr. Chair, you've done yourself proud this session as your first year as chair. Congratulations. And Mr. Vice Chair, as always, great work. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, raise your hand. The ayes have it. Now we have additional pages that we were moving in separately, supports for aging and medically frail incarcerated individuals. Would you like to move that separately?
Mr. Chair, I move the additional page.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Did we already move the juvenile court matters case reload?
We also have to do that. So I move that additional page as well, Mr. Chair.
And I second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, raise your hand. Are there any additional pages? I had these two. Those are the
That was
two.
it.
Okay, great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We can now move on to Transportation and Environment. Chair Watson, Vice Chair Edelson.
Good morning. First, I would like to thank the members of the subcommittee, Vice Chair Delegate Mark Edelson, Delegate Andrea Harrison, Delegate Rick Metzger, and Delegate Ryan Spiegel. Our committee staff, invaluable Yanisha Norris, the budget analysts, Sveshka Bushell, Andrew Gray, Kelly Norton, Samuel Quist, Yashadora Rai, and Elizabeth Weibel. Also would like to thank, for the first time, our committee had a fellow who was a second-year law student at Maryland Carey Law, Sean McGinley, who's in the back. I would also finally like to thank Cassandra Hassan, who formatted and edited the report. Beginning on page 1 with the Public Service Commission, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting arrearage and termination dated. In the Maryland Energy Administration, on pages 2 through 6, the subcommittee concurred with two pieces of language restricting funds pending submissions of reports on MEA funding and a report providing explanations on fund cancellations. The subcommittee concurred with two pieces of narrative requesting reports on Strategic Energy Investment Fund revenues, spending and balance, and federal grants available for energy-related purposes. The subcommittee modified narrative requesting a report on the usage of SEEF revenues. The subcommittee adopted narrative requesting a report on data centers and concurred with language making funds contingent on legislation authorizing expanded use of funds. On pages 7 through 10 for the Department of Planning, the subcommittee adopted language restricting funds pending a report, modified a language requesting a report on permits that impact the business community, and concurred with language adding clarification to contingent language. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting a report on historic revitalization tax credit utilization. In the Maryland Automobile Insurance Fund, on pages 11 and 12, the subcommittee modified narrative on financial statements, concurred with narrative on the insured division, and adopted narrative on the uninsured claims. On pages 13 and 14, for the Maryland Insurance Administration, the subcommittee concurred with two pieces of narrative requesting insurance tracking system project status and a report on Affordable Care Act segregated account funding data.
In the Department of Information Technology, on pages 15 through 20, the subcommittee concurred to delete general funds for two major information technology development projects and reduce funds for new positions. The subcommittee concurred with two narratives and a section restricting funds pending submission of a report on AI implementation. The subcommittee modified one piece of narrative requesting a report on Maryland benefits. In the Department of Transportation, on pages 21 and 22, the subcommittee concurred with annual language requiring notification of changes to the capital program. In the Department of Transportation, the Secretary's Office, on pages 23 through 26, the subcommittee concurred with 3 pieces of language and 2 pieces of narrative. On pages 27 through 29, for the Department of Transportation debt service requirements, the subcommittee concurred with 2 pieces of annual language establishing debt limits and requiring debt reports. In the State Highway Administration, on pages 30 and 31, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting a report on a traffic study plan and modified narrative on federal funding reimbursements. In the Maryland Port Administration, on page 32, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting reports on the Howard Street Tunnel project and modified narrative requesting reports on federal fund reimbursements. On pages 33 through 37 for the Maryland Transit Administration, the subcommittee adopted 2 pieces of language restricting funds pending reports on audible and text-based announcements on MTA vehicles and the status of a work group. The subcommittee struck language restricting funds for Purple Line marketing. The subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting bi-monthly status reports on the Purple Line and modified narrative requesting a report on the status of the Red Line project to also include the status of the Be More bus plan. The subcommittee also adopted narrative requesting bi-monthly status reports on the Red Line project.
In the Maryland Aviation Administration, on page 38, the subcommittee concurred with language restricting funds pending submission of a report on noise abatement procedure at Martin State Airport. In the Maryland Transportation Authority, on page 39, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting reports on the Francis Scott Key Bridge reconstruction. In the Department of Natural Resources, pages 40 through 44, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting a report on apprenticeships. The subcommittee also concurred with Deep Creek Lake Watershed Management Plan intent language. The subcommittee rejected language restricting funds pending submission of a letter confirming Port of Deposit State Historical Park land transfer and instead adopted narrative. The subcommittee concurred with 2 pieces of narrative requesting reports on the 2010 Trust Fund and Chesapeake Bay restoration spending. In the Department of Agriculture, on pages 45 through 47, the subcommittee increased the amount of funding restricting pending submission of a report on audit resolutions. The subcommittee concurred with apprenticeships narrative and partially restored funding for the Leaders in Environmentally Engaged Farming program. On pages 48 through 52, in the Department of Environment, the subcommittee reduced the funding restricted pending submission of a report on septic system regulations and standardization. The subcommittee concurred with the deletion of double-budgeted wastewater treatment plant operations and maintenance funding. The subcommittee adopted narrative on the Potomac Interceptor. The subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting a building energy performance standards report. In the Maryland Environmental Service, on page 53, the subcommittee concurred with narrative requesting an annual funding statement. That concludes the subcommittee's report. Motion to move the adoption of the subcommittee report.
Second.
Great. Excellent work as always, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, every year. Great work. Any discussion on the subcommittee report? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, raise your hand. The ayes have it. Thank you both so much. Capital Pay-Go is next. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the committee. I'd like to thank the members of the subcommittee, Vice Chair Delegate Mark Chang, Delegate Gabriel Acevero, Delegate Catherine Forbes, Delegate Jefferson Grice, Delegate Julian Ivey, Delegate Ann Kaiser, Delegate Alethea McCaskill, Delegate Rick Metzger, Delegate Emily Shetty, Delegate Stephanie Smith, and Delegate Courtney Watson. I'd also like to thank very much our committee counsel who, I don't know where you live, but you could probably be sitting in this chair. And so that person should be afraid for their seat. And that's Laura Hyde. The committee support staff as well, the lovely Carol Smith, and our budget analysts, Sarah Baker, Catherine Barber, Saveksha Bajel, Andrew Gray, Emily Haskell, Madeline Miller, Yoshidara Rai, Elizabeth Weibel, and Josh Weinstock. And I'd like to thank Emma Kozak, who edited this report, which is very brief. On page 1, in the Department of Natural Resources, The subcommittee made a technical correction to narrative that requests a report on Baltimore City projects that receive direct grant funding through program Open Space, and through that technical correction, we have preserved the right to talk more about the substance of that narrative in conference committee, and that would conclude the subcommittee report. I'd move the adoption of the subcommittee report.
All right. Your heavy lift comes next week, and we'll be ready for that. I know you're busy working on our capital budget, but for this, good work. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, now we're going to move to full committee decisions. Who's walking us through that? Oh, Jacob Cash, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You should have a white decision document packet titled House Appropriations Committee, Full Committee. I'll be walking through and discussing the actions that you'll be deciding on. Starting on page 1, for payments to civil divisions of the state, DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance, and the agency concurred and the Senate concurred.
So what we're going to do, committee, is either the vice chair or I will just make a motion to concur. We won't take a vote. If you have a problem with the concurrence, the rejection, or the modification, speak up. We can take a vote on it, but otherwise we'll just say move to concur and move on.
Great.
Page 2, for the General Assembly of Maryland, the recommendation was to concur. The Senate concurred.
Move to concur. All right, and let's just leave the vice chair's microphone on as well if we can. All right.
On page 3, for the Maryland Cannabis Administration, the recommendation was to reduce funds for the Cannabis Incubator Project. The agency disagreed and the Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
On page 4, for the Department of Budget and Management, Action 1, DLS recommended amending Section 2 to limit appropriations that can be placed into contingency reserve to items restricted only by the General Assembly. The agency disagreed as this limits executive authority. The first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 5, Action 2, DLS recommended amending Section 17 to add the tracking structure necessary for legislative audits and to disallow transfers to other purposes. The agency disagreed as this limits executive authority, but the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 6, Action 3, DLS recommended adding a section requiring long-term forecasts for the General Fund, Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund, and Higher Education Current Unrestricted Fund accounts. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 7, Action 4, DLS recommended adding an annual section applying across-the-board reductions to institutions of higher education. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 8, Action 5, DLS recommended adding an annual section requiring reporting on federal funds received by the state. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 9, Action 6, DLS recommended adding an annual section defining the use of federal funds in the budget. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 10, Action 7, DLS recommended adding an annual section requiring consistent presentation of budget data and organizational charts. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 12, Action 8, DLS recommended adding an annual section requiring reporting on interagency agreements and approval by the Department of Budget and Management. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 14, Action 9, DLS recommended adding an annual section defining the budget amendment process. The agency concurred in part, disagreeing with the requirement that budget amendments be submitted by October 31st. The first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 17, Action 10, DLS recommended adding an annual section requiring the maintenance of accounting systems for certain programs. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Then on page 19, Action 11, DLS recommended adding a section restricting funds in certain agency budgets pending timely submission of fiscal 2026 budget amendments. The agency disagreed and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 20, Action 12, DLS recommended restricting funds pending a report on American Rescue Plan Act funding. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 21, Action 13, DLS recommended striking language reducing funds contingent on elimination of the requirement to print budget books. The agency disagreed and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 21, action 14, DLS recommended adopting annual narrative requesting submission of budget details for contracts and grants. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 22, action 15, this begins the first house additional actions. The Senate added language restricting funds in DBM to require a review of cybersecurity governance and procedures in specified large agencies.
Move to reject.
On page 24, action 16, the Senate added language restricting funds in DBM to ensure that agencies with certain repeat audit findings collaborate with the state chief information security officer to resolve and report on those findings.
Move to concur.
On page 25, action 17, the Senate adopted narrative requesting a report on registered apprenticeship position capacity within state agencies.
Move to concur.
There are also actions in the additional page packet for your consideration. On page 2, this action is additional narrative requesting a report on deficiency appropriations, guidelines, and trends.
Move to concur. Move to adopt.
And then on page 3, this is additional narrative requesting a report on the monitoring of potential shortfalls.
Move to adopt.
Now, moving back to the decision document packet. For the Department of Budget Management personnel, on page 27, action 1, DLS recommended reducing funds for salary step expansions. The agency disagreed and the first house rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 2, DLS recommended adding an annual section for annual language restricting the movement of employees into abolished positions. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 27, item 3, DLS recommended adding an annual section requiring monthly reporting on the state's workers' compensation account held by the Injured Workers Insurance Fund, and the agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 28, item 4, DLS recommended adding an annual section for the rule of 100 limit on the position creation ability by BPW, and the agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 30, action 5, DLS recommended adding an annual section for language requiring a report on state positions. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 31, action 6, DLS recommended adding an annual section requiring the reporting of employee and retiree health insurance receipts and tracking of those receipts, and the agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 32, action 7, DLS recommended adding a section reducing general funds in the Department of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services due to special fund availability in the Senior Prescription Drug Affordability Program Fund to support certain health insurance costs. This is a fund swap. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 33, action 8, DLS recommended adding annual language restricting funds due to 4 or more repeat audit findings. The agency concurred.
Move to concur.
That's the first house adopted, yes, sorry. On page 34, action 9, DLS recommended adopting annual committee narrative requesting the department submit closeout information on the employee and retiree health insurance account. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 35, action 10, DLS recommended adopting committee narrative requesting submission of quarterly reports on prescription, medical, and dental plans, including an analysis of reporting methodologies. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
And on page 36, action 11, DLS recommended adopting committee narrative requesting a report detailing the government modernization initiative. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
Oh, sorry, on page 37.
37. Move to concur.
Move to concur, sorry.
Then for the State Retirement Agency on page 38, DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 39, Maryland Supplemental Retirement Plans, DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the Senate concurred.
Move to concur.
On page 40 is the public debt. DLS recommendation was to concur with the allowance. Agency concurred. and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Then for the State Reserve Fund on page 41, on pages 41 and 42, actions 3 and 8, this is DLS recommendation to reduce funds and strike technical language for legislative priorities so that those funds can be added back as desired. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
And then item 4, DLS recommended adding a section restricting funds in DBM and the Office of the Comptroller pending submission of a report identifying the purpose to which funds are returned to the DPA. DBM disagreed and a response was not provided by the Comptroller, and the first House adopted. And there is a color page in the color page packet, page 1, which would turn this into narrative.
So move to reject and adopt page 1.
Got it. Thank you. That concludes the full committee decisions.
There's one last additional page before we turn to the BRFA. Page 4 of the, I guess it's goldenrod pages. This would add a section authorizing the governor to process a budget amendment in fiscal 27 from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund for various purposes.
Move to adopt.
I think this page would tackle a number of goals. First, the theme of SEEF and the goals of SEEF, but also some affordability issues with regard to heat pumps, which has been a mandate from the speaker. So as the Vice Chair said, we'll adopt this.
Right. So next we'll turn to the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act actions. There are 3 documents related to that, a purple kind of tally sheet and 2 sets of additional pages, a coral page and a pink page, and I'll refer to those when we get to the appropriate spots. Starting on the purple tally sheet or lilac tally sheet, item 1 would reduce the mandate for the Maryland Healthy Soils Program by $100,000. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 2 would repeal the mandate for the Native Plants Program, and the Senate rejected.
Concur. Move to concur.
Item 3 would expand the allowable uses of the Cannabis Business Assistance Fund for 3 years to include operating costs of up to $5 million for the Department of Social and Economic Mobility. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 4 would reduce the mandate for the Tri-County Council for Southern Maryland from the Cigarette Restitution Fund by $300,000. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 5 would eliminate the mandated appropriation for the Lacrosse Opportunities Program. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 6 would reduce the mandate for the Coordinated Community Sports Partnership Fund by $20 million. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 7 limits the growth for each community college under the CADE funding formula to 3% for fiscal 27 through 2029. The Senate adopted that along with 3 items shown on pages 1 through 3 of the Coral packet, which reduce the funds in fiscal 2027 directly and specify the allocation.
Move to concur.
You're also going to concur with pages 1 through 3 here, correct? Yes.
Item 8 alters the funding formula for BCCC, reducing the percentage of the funding for the selected 4-year institutions that BCCC receives by 1 percentage point. As introduced, this would be permanent. The Senate modified to alter the formula for 2027 through 2029 only.
Move to concur.
Item 9 alters the funding for the Sellinger program to level fund the program for fiscal 27 to 29 at the fiscal 26 level by specifying the distribution per university at that level. And on page 4 of the Coral packet, the Senate also reduced these funds in fiscal 27 directly.
Move to concur and with the additional page. Move to concur.
Item 10 would reduce the mandate for the Community College Promise Scholarship by $1 million beginning in fiscal '27. The Senate rejected the provision, but on page 5 of the Coral package, they did reduce the fiscal '27 funding.
We're going to concur, but we're also going to reject the $1 million cut.
Okay. Item 11 reduces the mandate for the loan assistance repayment program for police officers and probation agents by $1.5 million. The Senate adopted that along with page 6 of the Coral package, which was to reduce the fiscal '27 funds directly.
Move to concur and with the additional pages.
Item 12 is a similar item, reducing the funding for the Maryland Police Officer and Probation Agent Scholarship Program by $1.5 million. The Senate adopted along with the page 7 of the Coral pages, which is to reduce the fiscal '27 funds directly.
Move to concur and move to concur with the additional pages.
Item 13 expands the allowable uses of the Advanced Directive Program Fund in fiscal '27 only to include $1 million to support maternal and child health quality initiatives. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 14 would phase in local cost share for the Assisted Outpatient Treatment Program beginning in fiscal 2028. The Senate adopted.
Move to reject.
Item 15 reduces the mandate for the tobacco use prevention program to $17.52 million. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 16 expands the allowable uses for the Board of Physicians Fund to include $2 million of fund balance in fiscal 2027 only to support the loan assistance repayment program for the physicians and physicians assistants. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 17 expands the allowable uses of the State Board of Professional Counselors and Therapists funds in fiscal 2027 only to include $500,000 to support provider reimbursements in the Behavioral Health Administration. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 18 reduces the mandate for the Public Safety Apprenticeship Program to $390,000 beginning in fiscal 2026. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 19 reduces the mandate for the Career Pathways for Healthcare Workers Program by $150,000 beginning in fiscal '27. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 20 suspends the requirement that the disparity grant be distributed through the formula, instead level funds it at the fiscal 26 statutory levels for 3 years through fiscal 29. The Senate rejected.
I'm going to move to concur, and I'm also going to thank the Senate for recognizing this vital funding needs restored to our counties who can least afford to absorb these cuts. Obviously, I have a parochial issue with Prince George's, but there are other counties who can least afford it. And just to name those so that it's on the record, Allegheny County, this cut will restore $6 million. Caroline County, rejecting this, will restore $841,000. Dorchester County, $664,000. Garrett County, $83,000. Somerset County, $762,000. Washington County, $316,000. And Wacomico County, almost $500,000. Those sums may not sound huge, but to our small counties, I think many of our folks who represent the small counties can tell you that these are big numbers for them. So move to concur with the Senate rejection of the cut.
Item 21 reduces the mandate for the Prince George's County Reentry Employment Incentive Program by $150,000. The mandate's scheduled to end in fiscal 28, so it's a 2-year impact. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 22 eliminates for 2 years the mandate for the Department of Natural Resources to distribute some funds to the from the Waterway Improvement Fund to a statewide historic preservation nonprofit. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 23 and would have expanded the allowable uses of the 911 Trust Fund to include program operations of the Department of Emergency Management. In 23 DBM Alt, the DBM proposed striking the provision. The Senate agreed to strike the provision.
Move to concur.
Item 24 would reduce the mandate for the small commercial project trust account within the historic revitalization tax credit. The Senate rejected, but on page 8 of the Coral pages, they did reduce the funds in fiscal 2027.
Move to concur and with the additional page 8. Thank you.
Item 25 is the provision that would repeal the requirement to provide the printed copies of the budget books. The Senate rejected, and based on your earlier action in the decision document, you would want to concur with that.
Move to concur.
Item 26 suspends the requirement in fiscal 2027 only that the governor appropriate the appropriate general fund surplus to the rainy day fund. The Senate adopted that, and on page 9 of the Coral pages, they reduced those funds directly in the budget.
Move to concur and with the additional pages.
Item 27 would eliminate in fiscal 2027 only the requirement that the governor provide $8 million from the cigarette restitution fund to the Community Health Resources Commission. There was only a $1 million reduction contingent on this. They actually had a $2 million balance in DLS on page 10, recommended increasing that reduction to $2 million, reflecting their available balance. The agency concurred, and the Senate adopted the provision as introduced and the increased reduction.
Move to concur and with the additional pages 10 and 11.
On page 4, item 28 expands the authorized uses of the funds from the separate account in the cigarette restitution funds that supports the HBCU settlement in fiscal 2027 only for the amounts above $35 million, and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 29 modifies the purposes of the Strategic Energy Investment Program related to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative funding to include strengthening the state's climate and mitigation, climate resiliency, and expand particular sources and uses of the funds, particularly related to the Department of Emergency Management. It also expands uses related to the power plant research program. And in 29 DBM Alt, DBM proposed an amendment to kind of clarify that particular portion of the provision. The Senate adopted with that modification.
Move to concur.
For items 30, which kind of take up all of page 5, as there were various alternatives proposed as part of that. As introduced, the BRFA provided particular expanded allowable uses in fiscal 2027, as well as a broader authorization for 27 through 2031. If you look at the pink pages, I'll just direct you to page 1, which provides kind of a more of a summary of what the Senate modifications did. The Senate modifications struck a number of those specific 27 authorized uses, and then deleted the associated funding for some of those, and instead added funding through a section for purposes that are identified on this page, including down payment on Empower Maryland residential programming costs, partially offsetting ratepayer costs for the limited income discount program, providing a grant program and MEA for a reverse auction, providing additional funding for the energy storage program, providing additional funding, providing funding for HVAC upgrades at public schools, and MDE, providing funds for costs associated with implementing the Cherish Act. They also maintained funding that was contingent in the Department of General Services for solar on state facilities. That was contingent on the BRFA. For the higher education research grant, they maintained that authorization expansion in the BRFA, clarifying that the funds can be used for any research purposes, and also maintaining the transfers as proposed in the BRFA related to the alternative compliance payment at $259 million and the transfer to the general fund from the Reggie administration account at $33 million. The page kind of identifies what actions would be taken on the BRFA. The remaining pages in that particular document are the kind of the conforming budget actions that we would adopt based on what you would want to do with this.
So I think we can take pages 2 through 14, the entire packet in total, if that's okay with everyone, and we'll move to concur.
Okay, that will take care of all of page 5 on the tally sheet. Back on the tally sheet on page 6, item 31, as introduced, reduce the participation targets for the Young Adult Service Year Option Pathway Program in fiscal 27 and 28 by 400 and 450 respectively. DLS recommended modifying that to implement a one-year delay, so you would hold at the 26 level and then do what was proposed initially, getting to the 2,000 target in fiscal 2030 instead of 2029. Additional page 12 in the Coral packet would be the budget actions you would take to implement that action. The Senate adopted the provision as introduced and rejected the DLS recommendation.
Move to reject.
So to clarify, you would be,
And adopt page 12.
yeah, okay. All right, on page 32, or item 32, the provision as introduced reduces the state share of the teacher, community college and library retirement by 50% of the increase between fiscal 26 and 27. DLS had recommended increasing that to 100%, and the Coral pages 13 through 15 are the actions that would conform to the DLS recommendation. The Senate adopted the provision as introduced and rejected the items on the Coral pages.
Move to concur and with the 3 additional pages.
We're going to reject the 3 additional pages, I think, right?
You're concurring to reject the 3 additional pages?
Yes.
Yeah.
Concurring to reject.
On item 33, this relates to a provision that was in the BRFA last year related to a transfer from the local income tax reserve account to support the division of paid leave related to the delay in implementation of the family program. It was making some technical corrections related to where the transfer goes and the timing of the transfer. DLS recommended in 33 DLS Alt an additional technical correction to the date for the transfer. The Senate adopted the provision with the modification in 33 DLS Alt.
Move to concur.
Item 33 DLS Alt 2 authorizes a transfer of $150 million from the local income tax reserve account to the general fund in fiscal 26. That was part of the governor's budget plan, but there was no provision to effectuate. The Senate modified that to transfer $380 million, which reflects a higher level of over-allocation.
Move to concur.
Item 34 is a provision that redirects in fiscal 27 only about $71.7 million from the transfer tax revenue to the general fund, which is replaced with bonds, and also transfers a small amount from the kind of reserve account. The Senate rejected that provision and adopted the item on page 16, which, with the funds being provided in the budget instead of GO bonds, restricts some of the funding to the purpose for which it was intended.
Move to concur and with the additional page.
Item 35 Item 35 of the BRFA reduces the mandate for the Urban Agriculture, Water, and Power Infrastructure Grant by $100,000. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 7, item 36 extends the expansion of the allowable uses of MEMSOFT to support the Aviation Command, which would have ended in last year's BRFA in fiscal 26 to extend it to 2029. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
In item 37, this repeals the requirement that $2 million from the uninsured motorist penalty be distributed to the Driver Education and Public High Schools Fund annually. The Senate rejected.
Move to reject.
Item 38 would require funding from the program Open Space to be used to support the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 39 requires the Heritage Conservation Fund and any other funds appropriated to the program Open Space stateside be included as part of the state land acquisition balance. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 40 relates to decoupling from a provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act related to the depreciation allowance. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 41 is also related to partially decoupling from a provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act related to depreciation.
Move to concur.
Item 42 repeals the requirement that the Department of Health apply to the federal government for inclusion in the state certified community behavioral health clinic demonstration program, changing the date by which the authorization would occur and making it subject to the limitations of the budget. The Senate rejected.
We're going to actually move to concur here.
On item 43, this is a provision that authorizes $980,000 that were restricted in fiscal 2020 or 2018 to be used for a particular purchase by the College of Southern Maryland that did not move forward, and instead, so this would allow the funds to be used for any POS land acquisition. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Based on the actions you took on the pink package related to see if you would want to concur with the Senate on item 40 and 44 DVM alt.
Move to concur.
On item 45, as introduced, this is a provision that would have transferred $187.6 million from the Fiscal Responsibility Fund to the General Fund in fiscal 2026. In 45 DBM alt, they proposed decreasing that amount to $178.5 million because $9 million of the funds were in the fiscal 26 budget. The Senate modified the transfer amount to $119.2 million. And then in page 18 and 19 of the Coral pages, they reduced $59.3 million from the Information Technology Investment Fund, general funds in fiscal 27, and then in 24, then added the funds in fiscal 2026 from the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. So they reduced the transfer, they expanded the allowable uses of the funds, and then they provided the funds in this way.
Move to concur and with the two additional pages.
Item 46 also relates to CEIF transfers that you adopted on the additional pages, so you would concur with that action.
Move to concur.
Item 47, as introduced, authorize the governor to transfer $10 million from the Loan Assistance Repayment Program for nurses and nursing support staff to the general fund in fiscal 2026. In 47, DBM Alt, they proposed an amendment to correct the fund from which the funds would be transferred to the Nurse Support Program Assistance Fund, and the Senate adopted the provision with that modification.
Move to concur.
Item 48 authorizes a transfer of $2 million from the Performance Incentive Grant Fund to the general fund, and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 49 is a provision that authorizes the governor to transfer a total of $1 million from the dedicated purpose account to the general fund in fiscal 2026, reflecting a variety of funds from fiscal 2023 that have been unspent. In 49, DLS Alt, DLS recommended increasing the amount of transfers from the dedicated purpose account by $1.1 million for three particular purposes, including comptroller, cybersecurity, rebuilding state government, and food banks. The Senate adopted the provision as introduced and modified the DLS recommendation to authorize the transfer from only the rebuilding state government funds and food bank funds, leaving the funds for the comptroller, cybersecurity.
Move to concur.
Item 50 authorizes the governor to transfer $6.7 million from the Maternal and Child Health Population Improvement Fund to the general fund in fiscal 2027, and the Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 51 authorizes the transfer of $70 million from the Bay Restoration Fund, which is replaced with general obligation bonds. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 52 authorized the transfer of $13.1 million from the Waterway Improvement Fund to the general fund in fiscal 27, which would be replaced with general obligation bonds. The Senate modified that to transfer only $7 million.
Move to concur.
Item 53 relates to funds that were restricted in the fiscal 2026 budget. Related to the Department of Juvenile Services. They were restricted to be used for reopening Noise as a adolescent drug treatment center. This provision alters that to instead allow the funds to be used to provide drug treatment services at other youth-serving facilities and reopen Noise as a facility for children. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 54 prohibits rate increases for the non-public placement providers in fiscal 2027. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 55 prohibits rate increases in fiscal 2027 for providers whose rates are set by the Interagency Rates Committee. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 56 authorizes the Interagency Commission on School Construction to reallocate fiscal 2022 and 2023 funds related to HVAC upgrades for public schools to comply with stimulus fund spending requirements. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
In item 57, DBM additional, this proposes to eliminate the mandate for the open source phonics matching grant program. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
In item 58, this would expand the authorized uses of the African American Heritage Preservation Grant Fund to include non-capital projects. The Senate adopted but modified to clarify that any amounts used for non-capital projects would be above the mandate of $5 million.
Move to concur.
Item 59 alters the mandate for the Title IX Representation Proceedings Program to be a mandate to the program rather than the fund. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 60, DBM additional authorizes a transfer of $1 million from the non-depository institution fund to the general fund, and the Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 61, DBM additional authorizes a transfer of $600,000 from the state-aided institutions field trip fund to the general fund in fiscal 2026. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
So in the BRFA of 2025, there was a provision that reduced the amount that the Maryland Higher Education Commission could authorize from the student loan tax credit from 18 million to 9 million and required a report. The report was not submitted. DLS recommended extending that reduction of $9 million through tax year 2026 and alter the date by which the report would be submitted. In 101 DBM Alt, this would actually eliminate the $9 million cap in tax year 2025. The Senate adopted the DLS recommendation, and on the DBM alternative related to tax year 2025, they modified that to increase the cap to $16 million.
Move to concur.
In item 102, DLS additional, this was a recommendation to reduce the mandated growth in the per pupil special education funding formula to provide a growth rate of 5% in fiscal 27 through 2030. The Senate rejected. Page 20 of the Coral package is language that would go along with the DLS recommendation.
Move to concur and with the additional page.
On, sorry, I turned the wrong way. Item 133, this recommendation reduces the required distribution from the state lottery fund to the major sports and entertainment event program fund by $5 million. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 104 authorizes a transfer of $2 million from the Police Training and Standards Commission Fund to the general fund. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 105 reduces the mandate for the Equitech Growth Fund by $2 million. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 106 reduces the required distribution from the Lottery Fund to the Racing and Community Development Fund in fiscal 2026 only to reflect an action taken in the budget in fiscal 26. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 107, DLS recommended altering the full-day pre-K funding formula, delaying the expansion of the Tier 2 full-day pre-K, but capping the eligibility at 360% of federal poverty in fiscal 2027 and reducing the per pupil amount. The Senate modified that to limit the cap on eligibility to 450% rather than 600%. And on page 21, the first item was related to the DLS recommendation. The second item is the modification that was adopted by the Senate.
Move to concur and with the additional page.
On item 108, this is a provision that authorizes in fiscal 2027 only $250,000 from the Child Care Capital Support Revolving Loan Fund to be used by the Health Benefit Exchange for outreach campaign and survey. This also relates to funding that was restricted in fiscal 2026, but the funds were not allowed to be used for that purpose. The Senate adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 109 is a recommendation to cap the value of the final certificates on the More Jobs for Marylanders program at $15 million beginning in fiscal 2027, establish a sunset date, and alter the time, how the funds get to the general fund from the reserve fund. Item 23 in the Coral pages is a DLS recommendation that goes along with the portion that caps the amount of the that can be awarded. The Senate rejected the provision along with the Coral page.
Move to reject and to adopt the Coral page. The extra page. Thank you.
Item 110 would level fund the State Arts Council at the fiscal 2026 working appropriation level. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 111 would repeal a mandated distribution from the state admissions and amusement tax revenue to the State Arts Council and redirect the revenue to the general fund. The Coral page 24 is a page that would go along with the DLS recommendation. The Senate rejected both of those.
Move to concur and with the additional page.
Item 112, DLS recommended sunsetting the film production activity tax credit, and the Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 113 is a DLS recommendation to sweep unused general fund supported appropriations from non-income-based financial assistance programs to the general fund instead of the need-based student financial assistance fund. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 114 sweeps unused special fund supported appropriation for the Teaching Fellows scholarship to the Blueprint Fund, which is the source of the special funds, instead of the need-based student financial assistance fund. The Senate rejected.
Move to concur.
The Senate also adopted a few additional items. So item 201 is an item they adopted that delays the effective date of legislation enacted last year related to collections of certain hotel taxes.
Move to concur.
Item 202 is an item the Senate adopted to repeal the 3-year requirement in statute for the retention of certain medication data and authorize the Secretary of Health to establish the retention period through regulation.
Move to concur.
Item 203 was a provision adopted by the Senate to require the suspension of the state aid for police protection program funding to a law enforcement agency if GOCPP determines the agency is not in compliance with state law related to immigration enforcement agreements.
Move to concur.
And the final item was an item that alters, beginning in fiscal 28, the definition of a historic motor vehicle to be a vehicle that's at least 25 years old rather than specifying for model years 1999 or older.
Move to reject.
Mr. Chairman, I think that concludes your PERFA items. I think the last thing on your desk is the white additions packet. The first part of that packet, the first half of the first page, are shared House Senate ads. The Senate did most of these. As you can see, there's a couple of new items there, as well as a slight change to one. Mr. Chairman, the first and largest of those items is the DDA, $23 million.
Yeah, before we go, and the members should take a minute to look at all the ads before we adopt them. But I do want to flag a few things and also say a few things about the additional money for DDA. First, I want to thank the Senate for working with us on the shared ads, and I want to make it clear to the public and to the members that these are shared ads, that the Senate and the House found money together for these ads. One particular I'd like to flag is the child care additional ad, which in conjunction with the legislative action that we've taken and the package the Speaker has put forward on the floor, will add, I think it was 3,700 new slots in child care scholarships. This is a big deal for affordability in our state. I think this money will go a long way to getting people back to work, not just affordability, but for our economy, with our comptroller having flagged how important these scholarships are to keeping people in the workforce and moving forward. And I thank the Senate for going together with the House on that ad. Also, I do want to flag the George Funds. We did a tour of Western Maryland this year, and we saw what great work the George Funds are doing with housing affordability, with redevelopment in Cumberland and Hagerstown, and we do have a big ad there in George Funds. As always, we've added money for our rape crisis centers and our domestic violence centers, just a priority for both of our committees. And you'll see the biggest ad we have back here is to DDA. And I think the decisions that we've made on DDA these last 2 years have been at times some of the most gratifying, but also at times some of the most agonizing and heartbreaking. And as a committee, certainly it's gratifying to see last year we were able to restore hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts to this program. I think it's been really gratifying to see the success over the last 4 years of the program, having doubled over $1 billion of increased funding in this program. I think is certainly gratifying. As a committee, as an appropriations committee, we have to look at long-term sustainability of any program, right? It would be malpractice for a fiscal committee not to do that. But I don't think that's where we've led in DDA, actually. I think when we've looked at DDA, what we've looked at is we've led with sort of our values. Our speaker has told us to prioritize our most vulnerable communities. I think we've done that when we've tried to do that. But there's a third consideration which has come to light this year, which is cost neutrality. As we know, we have a Medicaid match in DDA to the tune of billions of dollars. That Medicaid match requires us for each participant's budget on average not to exceed the cost of institutionalization. And if it does, we lose the program. The program is flushed, and that is something we cannot bear. That is something that would be agonizing and heartbreaking. And so we had to roll up our sleeves this year and look at where can we find some cost containment to make sure that we do not lose billions of dollars of Medicaid funding. I want to thank the subcommittee chair for her work on this. I know, and I want to thank the administration for their work. And Hannah, I see you back there. I know you had 90 meetings with the community before session. I know the MidSAC has met weekly on this. I know our subcommittee chair has attended those. And so we have worked, I think, with the administration and the Senate and the community to find what I think the senator, the budget and tax chair called the least worst options. And I think we have found those and we've restored some money. And I just want to thank everyone for their participation. This is something we are going to continue to work at to make sure this program works and delivers services for this community. I don't want to bury the lead here and spoil the surprise, but there will also be $2.5 million, I think, in supplemental to address an independent look at this and how we can make sure that the agency is getting the benefits in a cost-efficient way to this very vulnerable community. I want to invite the subcommittee chair for any remarks she'd like to make because she has worked so hard. And I can't leave here without also thanking our speaker. I'll thank her again at the end before we adopt the budget, but her work on this last year to restore this money and her determination that we do the least harm we could this session is with any cost containment we make is kind of how we ended up here. Madam Subcommittee Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not have any prepared remarks for this, but I just want to say, these are really difficult decisions that we make, and we don't take them lightly. I know every single member on this committee, every single member in this chamber, certainly the administration as well, has heard from thousands of Marylanders who benefit from this program. And it is a real investment that is bipartisan, that every single one of us want to make sure we're taking care of this incredibly important community. I often say that, we are privileged to get to serve some of the best Marylanders through this budget. And we're very lucky to be able to do that. But we are so close to losing our federal matching dollars that if we don't take immediate action now, 19,000 Marylanders who benefit from this program would be left with nothing. And so these are all really, really tough choices. It's not something we took lightly. I'm very grateful, Mr. Chair, Madam Speaker, and to our Senate partners for the commitment of restoring nearly $25 million. I think that's a really important thing to note, and really grateful for the advocates who came together and suggested many of the solutions that we ultimately adopted as part of this budget deal. So thank you so much for the opportunity to work in partnership with you and the Speaker and the Senate on this. Thank you.
And once again, thank you and your subcommittee for your hard work. Any other questions on the ads, either the Senate ads, the shared ads, or the independent House ads before we adopt them? All in favor of adopting all of the ads, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, raise your hand. The ads are adopted. Any other work before us before we adopt the budget in the BRFA?
Nope, I think you just need to adopt the two bills.
All right, we're going to start with the budget of the state of Maryland. I'll move the budget of the state of Maryland.
Second.
Any additional discussion on the budget of the state of Maryland? Roll call.
Vice Chair Kaiser.
Yes.
Vice Chair Kaiser is a yay. Delegate Smith.
Yes.
Delegate Smith is a yay. Delegate Shetty. Delegate Shetty is a yay. Delegate Watson. Delegate Watson is a yay. Delegate McCaskill.
Yay.
Delegate McCaskill is a yay. Delegate Ruff.
Yes.
Delegate Ruff is a yay. Delegate Geist. Delegate Geist is a yay. Delegate Ivy.
Absolutely.
Delegate Ivy is a yay. Delegate Jones.
Yes.
Delegate Jones is a yay. Delegate Tolles.
Yes.
Delegate Tolles is a yay. Delegate Spiegel.
Yes.
Delegate Spiegel is a yay. Delegate Beecham.
Yes.
Delegate Beecham is a yay. Delegate Stonko. Delegate Stonko is a yay. Delegate Wolek. Delegate Wolek is a yay. Delegate Heinbaugh. Delegate Heinbaugh is a yay. Delegate Harrison. Delegate Harrison is a yay. Delegate Metzger. Delegate Metzger is a yay. Delegate Edelson. Delegate Edelson is a yay. Delegate Chang. Delegate Chang is a yay. Delegate Osivero. Delegate Osivero is a yay. Delegate Forbes. Delegate Forbes is a yay. Chair Barnes.
Yes.
Chair Barnes is a yay.
All right, we have a budget of the state of Maryland. Congratulations. We don't have a balanced budget yet. We need to adopt a BRFA before this budget is balanced. So I will move the BRFA of the state of Maryland.
Second.
Vice Chair Kaiser. Vice Chair Kaiser is a yay. Delegate Smith. Delegate Smith is a yay. Delegate Shetty. Delegate Shetty is a yay. Delegate Watson. Delegate Watson is a yay. Delegate McCaskill. Delegate McCaskill is a yay. Delegate Ruff.
Yes.
Delegate Ruff is a yay. Delegate Geist. Delegate Geist is a no. Delegate Ivy.
Yes.
Delegate Ivy is a yay. Delegate Jones.
Yes.
Delegate Jones is a yay. Delegate Tolles.
Yes.
Delegate Tolles is a yay. Delegate Spiegel.
Yes.
Delegate Spiegel is a yay. Delegate Beecham.
No.
Delegate Beecham is a no. Delegate Stonko. Delegate Stonko is a no. Delegate Wolek. Delegate Wolek is a yay. Delegate Heinbaugh. Delegate Heinbaugh is a yay. Delegate Harrison. Delegate Harrison is a yay. Delegate Metzger. Delegate Metzger is a no. Delegate Edelson. Delegate Edelson is a yay. Delegate Chang. Delegate Chang is a yay. Delegate Osivero. Delegate Osivero is a yay. Delegate Forbes. Delegate Forbes is a yay. Chair Barnes.
Yes.
Chair Barnes is a yay.
All right, the BRFA passes. A few remarks here. Just I want to make some thank yous, but first I want to just reflect a little bit on the budget that you all have passed. David, I think we've ended with a surplus of about $250 million. Is that right? In excess of $250 million. I want to be clear, every year when we pass a budget, we pass it with a surplus. We call it fund balance, but a fund balance is a surplus. Typically, it's about $100 million. That's where DLS usually recommends that we be to be safe, to deal with any deficiencies or contingencies that come up through the year. This year, we have passed a budget with in excess of $250 million surplus. I think that says a lot about the work that you all have done in your subcommittees, the conservative approach you've taken to budgeting in these times. But we've done it also by making sure that our most treasured programs are funded, fully funding public education, restoring funding for things that we mentioned earlier in our restorations. And I just think that you all should be proud, and I think it's reflected in the unanimous vote for the budget from this committee as it heads to the floor. I want to thank every member and every subcommittee member for that work. We could not have gotten this done without the hard work of David, Tanya, Department of Legislative Services, and your team. You know, you say something every year and it starts to sound cliche, but I want you to know that we mean this. We could not do this work without you. The late nights that you put in, the recommendations that you make, thank you all and your entire team so much for your work. We have the greatest budget and, committee analysts in town, right? Laura, Joe, and Yanisha, your first year here, great work. Our committee coordinator, Carol, thank you so much, and my aide. And I have to thank my assistant, Addie, for all the work she's done in following our ads. I want to thank our speaker, who has rolled right into a budget. She has not worked on budget issues before, and she rolled right in, rolled her sleeves up, and got to work, and made prioritizing vulnerable communities and affordability her priority. I think this budget reflects those priorities. And I want to thank her, and I also want to thank her team. Tom, who's been with us all year, back from the old Cass Taylor days, back into the budget. Thank you so much for what you've done, and our speaker. So we'll head to the floor with the budget next week. Just again, thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.